Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final installment of the 2023 Legends of Simpson Lecture series today. I guess we always have to say, save the best till last, wait a little bit longer, and good things come. And we're glad that you stayed on with us today. But I am honored to have with us Simpson legend Nancy St. Clair as she presents Only Connect, an exploration of the forces that weaken, if not undermine completely, our need and desire for authentic connection. So it is now my pleasure to introduce Simpson legend Nancy St. Clair.
Thank you very much. When you first asked me if I would do this, it took me a while to grasp the idea that I could be a legend in any way, especially when one of my children pointed out that legends are usually dead, and I am still kicking, but thank you very much. Let me begin by talking about the title of my talk. You had given me a deadline for a title, and the deadline was fast approaching, and that deadline came at the end of 36 days, which had been very, very hard for me. During those days, I'd been living with my parents, who were 95 and 102, in their independent living apartment in the Twin Cities. And during that time, my mother had been in and out of the hospital, and I was staying with my father, who at 102 has dementia. Really no surprise there. At one point, my mother decided that she would stop all treatment and go into home hospice. She wanted to die at home. And during this time, I stayed with her. I told her I would stay with her until she died for the duration. We had to move my father into another wing of their building for people with dementia. My mother died a few days before Christmas, 5 days before their 72nd wedding anniversary. I then promptly got COVID. My husband, who ordinarily would have been with me to help, was in Decorah because his mother and brother had been hit by a car in a parking lot. And his mother, who also suffers from dementia, needed someone with her 24 hours a day, and he was doing that. I had a title, and I deliberately chose one that I could follow with a colon. This is what academics like to do. You get a title, you slap a colon after it, and then you can attach almost anything you want. So Only Connect, I could have added in time and space. I could have added in the world of Fox. I could have added anything. But I gave you a title and a paragraph with some ideas that were bubbling around in my mind. When I recovered from COVID, I started thinking that, okay, now I have to follow through. I have to actually write something. And I did start writing, and I was feeling very proud of what I was writing until, there's always an until. I was speaking one day to my cousin Bob, who is probably my closest family member. Now, Bob lives in North Carolina. He's a retired academic. He was the Dean of Arts and Sciences at the University of North Carolina in Greensboro. And I told him about my speech. I told him I was going to use a novel. I was going to use John Dunn. I was going to use Hemingway. I was going to use Isabel Wilkerson's cast. I was going to use so many different things. And he listened and he said, sounds very academic, sounds intellectual, sounds woke. Pause. I'd dump that sucker if I were you. And I was taken aback and I said, what? I've already written something. And he said, but it's lunchtime. People don't necessarily want to hear an academic paper. In fact, he said, I'm sure they don't. So then I had to think back about what I could write that would somehow connect to the title I'd given Andy and be more interesting than a conference paper. So I started thinking about the phrase Only Connect and the first time I heard it. And the first time I heard it was during a graduate seminar. The phrase comes from a novel that I love and maybe if you've taken classes from me, you've read. It's E.M. Forster's Howard's End. And Howard's End is a love story. Two people fall in love, but these two people are not the romantic comedy lead characters that you might imagine. The woman is in her 40s. She's never been married. She's independently well off. She has plenty of money. The man she falls in love with is the widow of a friend of hers who is in his 60s and is very much entrenched in the world of business. Nevertheless, they fall in love. They take a honeymoon, and then, as often happens, they return from the honeymoon and reality sets in. And they realize that they have many differences that go beyond the 20 years in their age, that are more located in their different world views. And it's not clear the marriage is going to survive. At one point, when the female is thinking about this, she realizes that the task is, and the phrase she uses is, only connect, only to connect. Now, ultimately, this being a romance novel of sorts, they do connect, but not until after someone has died, a child has gone to prison, there is a pregnancy out of wedlock. This is the 1920s, remember. And they resolve things. So connection occurs, but it's not without its difficulties, without its pain, without its penalties. The first time I read this book, I was in graduate school, and I was feeling way out of my league. And the novel spoke to me because I realized that if I was going to continue on the track I had started on, I needed very much to find a way to connect with the academic world. And I was able to do that. Years later, when I was a professor at Simpson, I taught this novel over and over again. This time, my motives were different. And it's important to realize that when we read a book of any sort, the context in which we read is essential to understand because it shapes our interpretation, it shapes what we value or don't value in the novel. When I was teaching the novel at Simpson, what I wanted to do was obviously connect with my students through a novel that I thought conveyed to them values connected to the liberal arts and which I thought would enhance their lives. And so I taught it, and I taught it many times. My mother was a great reader, and she loved to give advice, as mothers are wont to do. I know as a mother, I give much advice, most of it unwanted. And she was a great reader. When she got her first job, the first thing she did was to join the Book of the Month Club. And in the last week of her life, she fretted about not very much other than the fact that she was going to miss the next two books her book club had chosen to read. And she made me promise that I would read those books, one of which was a biography, a new biography of John Dunn, and the other, a new biography of Sam Adams. And I said I would. Now, my mother had spent her entire life as an adult, as a married woman, sleeping with my father. And so coming home from the hospital, knowing that he was in the same building, but no longer in her bed, was hard to take. And so she asked me to sleep with her. And so every night, these are wonderful memories. What we would do is sleep together, read on our Kindles, or as she got weaker, I would read aloud to her. And we read Howard's End. It was a book she had loved very much and I loved. And so we were connecting through a shared novel, something we both valued. And connection always involves social engagement. And this is how my mother and I were engaging, not the only way, but one of the ways, as she was dying. Now, Forster's belief that as humans, what we need to struggle to do is to connect with others is not a new theme. In 1624, in his Devotions Upon Emergent Occasions, John Dunn wrote a poem that I expect many of you know. It begins with these lines: "No man is an island unto himself." As I said earlier, the context in which we read and write is very, very important. Dunn wrote this poem after a year of illness. He had lost his wife. He was in despair. His faith was shaken. But he made it through that year, and he realized that he was able to do so because of the connections he had forged with others. He also realized that we are all interdependent. Bruce Haddix once said to me, and I think this was one of the many wise things he said to me, is that we only understand ourselves through our relationships with others. And this is something that Dunn was getting at. I think E.M. Forster was getting at it. I think many other writers have tried to explain or reinforce this point as well. It seems to me really important, especially now when I think the world is in crisis in so many ways. Environmentally, we seem to be heading for disaster. We share this world with so many other people, and yet in the United States, we use many more resources than others. We don't have enough of a sense of connection with the rest of the world to realize that our use of natural resources constitutes abuse, selfishness on some very, very on some strong level. Now, if you read happiness studies, which I do not, I read blurbs about happiness studies. One of the things that is stressed for people, if they indeed want to be happy, is the need to connect, to socialize with others. And so again, this theme of connection, community, interaction is being reinforced in many, many disciplines, in many, many forms. And yet, there's always an and yet, right? What is it that keeps us from forging connections that allow us to transcend ourselves, our egos? Let me give you some theories, and then we'll go from there. One of the books that I'm reading right now is called The Science of Evil. And this is by Simon Baron-Cohen. And the full title is The Science of Evil on Empathy and the Origins of Cruelty. Simon Baron-Cohen is head of psychiatry and psychology at Cambridge University, and he does a lot of work with autism. And he begins by reminding us of some of the experiments that the Nazis did during the Holocaust. And he asks, how do you explain such cruelty? Can a commitment of science really lead one to inflict on the Jews what the Nazi doctors did? And his initial answer is, well, apparently so. But he's really asking more about what is the nature of evil. And his answer is, and this might seem very simple, is the inability to empathize with others. And he goes on to suggest that there are reasons that are both personal as well as cultural that keep people from empathizing with others. He would say in people who have been diagnosed as sociopathic or psychotic, that this can be an issue of brain formation or brain chemistry. It can be based or traced back, I should say, to personal experiences, poverty, lack of nutrition, any other abuse that you might be able to imagine. But he also argues that there are systemic reasons for our inability to empathize with others. Now, a few years ago, Isabel Wilkerson wrote a book called Caste, and my guess is that quite a few of you have read this book already. It's wonderful. And what she points out is that when Hitler was trying to come up with his racial codes, his way for justifying the extinction, the final solution, he looked at American history, and he looked at the racial laws in the American South primarily up until the Civil War. And a light bulb went off, and he said, they got it right. Once you can convince one group of people that another group of people is not really human, right? That they are not like me, then it becomes easier to oppress them, to abuse them, to do whatever you feel you need to do to support, to reinforce, and to justify your own position of power. And he did at one point think that maybe in the South they'd gone a bit too far. He was a bit appalled at the amount of lynching that took place, and this strikes me as humorous. But again, Wilkerson, I think, is right that, as Hitler was right, that the moment you can distance yourself from someone else's or another group's humanity, the easier it is to deprive them of their basic humanity and those things that we believe humans have a right to. I worry a lot these days about the state of our world. It seems that every day when I read the newspaper in the morning, what I see is more attempts to deprive others of privileges or rights that seem to me should be innate to all of us. In Iowa, and well, actually across the nation, I see this happening more and more in the legislation that is passed or being proposed and then passed in many states to deprive LGBTQ folks of laws that ensure safety, right? And access to education, to home, to employment. And this worries me. I'm not sure, I know I don't have any solutions to these problems. I don't know how you can actually get people to see other people as deserving of the same rights that so many of us take for granted. But we do need that human connection. Ernest Hemingway, in one of his short stories written after World War I, has an old man sitting in a bar. And it's a clean, well-lighted place. That's the title of the story. And there are two bartenders, waiters, who are observing him. And the younger one, newly married, says, we need to close this joint down. We need to get this guy out of here. And I want to get home. And the older waiter says, what does it hurt? What does it hurt? He pays his bills. He's safe here. He has light. He has cleanliness. He has warmth. If you get home a few hours later, is it going to make difference? And the young newlywed man's answer is pretty much damn straight it makes a difference. And he leaves the bar. The older waiter, who I think perhaps because he is of an age with the patron, can't do that. He can't walk away. He knows that while it's great to have a clean, well-lighted place, there has to be more in most people's lives. He knows this man needs companionship, and he gets a form of it sitting in this bar, watching other people, perhaps having a conversation, brief as it may be. And so he lets that man, he lets the man stay. Years ago in college, I learned about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And hierarchy, by definition, means you start at one place and you work towards something higher. And what Maslow emphasized was that unless you take care of the basic needs, food, shelter, safety, those other needs that many of us value, especially those who have gone to college or value the liberal arts, intellectual achievement, intellectual development, intellectual curiosity, those things cannot be taken care of at all on an empty stomach without shelter. I'm going to stop here, and I think maybe I've raised more questions than I've answered, if I've answered any at all. But I think Socrates had it right when he made clear through his dialogues that the most interesting intellectual discussions take place through questions and answers, questions and attempts to answer those questions rather than having someone lecture you from a stage. As a professor, I was never very comfortable being the sage on the stage. I had questions and I wanted to hear what my students said. And a successful class was for me one in which there was lots of discussion. And so why don't I stop where I am now and you respond and tell me any questions you have or observations or certainly criticisms of what I've said.
Well, I'll jump in here, Nancy. Thank you so much for that presentation and that talk. And we have quite a few participants on, and hopefully you heard Nancy's call for questions, and you can submit those using the Q&A button below. And our first one has just come in, and it says, how do you see the human connections today and how they have changed because of the polarization climate we are in? Do you think we can still form those meaningful connections with people on the opposite side?
I am a Quaker, and during Sunday meetings, I sit in a room with people who see religion very differently than I do. And some of them believe, for example, in the resurrection. Some see themselves as atheists, but believe that folks working together can achieve something better. So theoretically, I believe we can bridge the divisiveness that faces this country. But I don't know. I know that after 2016, my husband and I found ourselves in an old hotel in Keosauqua. We couldn't bring ourselves to go back to my parents' home because various aunts and uncles and cousins were feeling quite different about the election than we were. And I felt so isolated from them. I don't know what it would take right now. I think the political discourse has become so uncivil, and I think you can trace that back to, I would trace it back, John Epperson could probably correct me on this, to Newt Gingrich's contract with America, in which a memo was actually passed around or circulated that suggested that a different kind of language be used to demonize those who disagreed with the Republicans. I think that was the start of a long slide into the murky area we are right now. I think we have to believe, though, if we don't believe that there's a way of bridging this gap, what do we have? I don't know.
I think that ties in pretty well with this next question, and it'll be interesting to see your thoughts on, do you think social media platforms allow or impede connections?
Um, I think they allow a certain type of connection. I think it's a fairly shallow type of connection. I personally have a love-hate relationship with Facebook. A few years ago, after it came out that so much information that was clearly destructive to the mental well-being of young people came out, was being promoted by Facebook, I said, well, enough of this. But I also, and went off for a long time. I also, though, during COVID, used Facebook to connect with people. I couldn't see my parents, who I'm very close to, was very close to. And Facebook was a way to connect with them and with cousins and with people I hadn't seen for a very long time. I don't know, I have to say that after I've spent some time on Facebook, I feel like I've wasted that time. I think of John Milton's sonnet that begins with, when I consider how my light is spent. And I thought, yeah, my light was spent just reading a lot of junk. We tend to read Facebook, I think, or other media tend to draw you to people who share your own beliefs. It doesn't really challenge you necessarily, and doesn't allow for, I think, the kind of in-depth discourse we need to solve problems.
Thank you for that. Is empathy something that can be taught?
Well, yes, it can, according to Simon Baron-Cohen, who some of you may recognize the name Baron-Cohen. This is Sacha Baron Cohen's, Borat's cousin. And there are lots of ways in which empathy can be taught. And some of these ways have been used in the past when people lived in different circumstances. For example, children who spend a lot of time with the elderly seem to acquire empathy earlier than others. But a lot of research on the brain has also shown that that part of the brain that is associated with empathy develops later than other parts of the brain for adolescents. This is what I think. But I hope, my husband and I retired to Decorah because our daughter and her husband, who was a Simpson alum, were expecting their first child, our first grandchild, and thought it would be lovely if that grandchild could have a lot of time with his grandparents. What that translated into was, will you be our full-time childcare providers? And we said yes without a second thought. Now we have two grandsons, and we provide childcare from 9 to 5, 5 days a week. And I would like to think that being around us, seeing us as we age, seeing us as we develop various maladies, is doing what brain scientists say it does, making them more, excuse me, empathetic to others.
Thank you. Here's another question that states, I always felt that Howard's End was a love story not between two people, but between a woman and a place. What do you think we can do to improve our connections between not only each other, but with our environment and the natural world?
Oh, that's a brilliant statement, and it's a brilliant assessment of the novel. Howard's Place, for those of you who haven't read it, is a home that the female protagonist inherits, and she inherits it from the woman who dies and whose husband she marries. Boy, I think the more time, well, in a lot of Scandinavian countries, there's something called forest bathing. Spending time outside clearly develops, not clearly, but seems to enhance one's appreciation and commitment to the natural world. I read recently an article in JAMA, which is the Journal of American Medicine, I think, Association. And it seems that the more young children, and these are the people who we have to rely on, the more time they spend outside in their early years, the fewer their mental health problems later in life. It seems that, they absorb on some level that nature can be very therapeutic, and it's worth caring about. My grandson goes to a preschool where the children are outside all day, every day, unless the temperature is below 30. Then they go inside. This would drive me nuts. I get cold easily, but he loves it, and he loves being outside, and it calms him. So, but you're right, whoever asked that question is absolutely about it being a love story that is more complicated, more complex than I indicated.
Great. Next question is, how do we, as queer people, form connections with people to help them see our humanity while also maintaining our safety?
Oh man, that's a good question. I bet I know who that came from. I don't know. I don't think I really can come up with an answer, because it's so dangerous these days, for queer people. It really is, or people of color. And, part of me wants to say this is the sort of old hippie flower child that just reach out. Love is the answer. Love is all we need. But I don't know. I don't know. I wish I had an answer for that. I live in a very progressive little town for the most part, and yet I have, well, my soon-to-be son-in-law visits, and he is a Sikh. So he has wears a turban, and he has a very long beard. He if he goes to some place like Walmart, it's pretty sure that somebody in a pickup truck is going to yell things at him. And he stays very patient about this. He's a psychiatrist, so I'm sure he has secret tools to preserve his mental health, but I don't have an answer for that. I wish I did. And I wish if I did have the answer, I could implement it.
With the generational divide in the workforce, it seems that baby boomers and Gen Z are not able to connect. How would you best create connections at work given that generational divide?
I think a generational divide is pretty inevitable. People who are at the older end of the spectrum often feel that they have worked hard to get where they are and that, they deserve respect. But they often forget that people just starting out bring fresh energy and fresh ideas and deserve respect for that as well. And, people starting out often feel that the old people are just that old. They assume often, especially in the academic world, I think that they haven't kept up with new ideas, new pedagogies. Um, and that is too bad. That's problematic, I think. One of the many, many, many things I valued about the late professor, the Reverend Dr. Roger Betzworth, is that as a senior faculty member, he really did see junior faculty members as resources. He read books they suggested. He paid close attention to what they were reading. And that is a very rare thing, I think.
Right. How can I open my mind enough to connect with people I fundamentally do not agree with?
There was something on Facebook that a former colleague had posted the other day about how we had to just recognize that we were connected with everybody and everybody was connected to us and blah, 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 blah. And in a snarky mode, I wrote back, but I don't want to be connected to Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis. I don't want to have any connection with those folks. And I admit I don't, but I have to remind myself that I have to force myself to think about what forces might have made them um, be the way they are. And it's easy to say raw ambition, total disregard for anybody else in the world besides themselves. But I have to just keep focusing on that little bit of the divine that as a Quaker, I believe is in everybody. And I have to think about ways that I can cultivate this. And this is hard, hard work. It's not work that, I often run to embrace, but I think it's got to be done.
What role do you believe the humanities can play in encouraging human connection?
What role? I think one of the things that's most basic is doing our best to make sure that our fellow inhabitants of this planet have food, have shelter, have medical care, have opportunities. And if that means that we have to give up some of what we have, so be it. I was going to look up this John Wesley phrase or passage before I started today, and then I forgot. But what he says is give what you can, do what you can, and then there's a third thing. And I'm sure there's a Methodist in the audience. That would be you, Bruce Haddix, I think, who could finish that off for me. But I think in a nutshell, that's great advice. And to ask yourself too, when you're doing retail therapy or whatever, what are the consequences of buying such and such? How does it impact not just my mood in the moment, but how does it, the means of production, impact those who created this item? And how will the disposal of this item impact the larger environment?
We have quite a few questions that have not been answered, and we are coming up on our time here. So I think I'll ask two more questions. And if any of you would like to pose those questions later, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to share contact information with Nancy as well.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from people from Simpson. Since, I mean, I got so much out of my years at Simpson, and it has meant a lot to me that students have stayed in touch. I am a birth doula, and in the years since I've left Simpson, I've helped deliver students' babies. I've married people. So I am always happy to share contact information and continue these conversations. They benefit me greatly.
And so, second to last question we will ask is, why do you think political opinion differences are any greater today than back in the days of Socrates or the days of Hamilton and Jefferson?
Well, I think let's remember that Socrates, was killed for his opinions, right? And that in the days of Jefferson and Hamilton, some differences of opinion were worked out on the dueling field. It's easy to glorify the past, in part because the language that was used is so much more elegant than what is used today. And we also have to think about how who got to express opinions, why they got to express opinions, what training they had to express opinions, and the means of communication available to them. So Thomas Jefferson had tools at his disposal that, a backwoods farmer in Tennessee did not. And one of the interesting things that happens when you read history, and I find myself as I get older reading more and more and more history, is you realize, just how brutal things have been. I mean, think about before the Civil War, the Southern slave owner in the Senate or the House beat to a pulp an abolitionist who took over a year to recover from that beating. So I'm not sure. I think I might have forgotten part of the question at this point, but yeah.
That's okay. And we'll end with hopefully what I'm hoping will be a positive response. But are there things that give you hope for the future and our ability to connect with one another? If so, what are they?
Oh, children, my grandchildren. At the end of the day, when they leave, my husband and I look at each other and we're exhausted. But I see, I have so much hope in children. First of all, their capacity for joy unfettered joy gives me happiness when I'm not feeling any. But I also see their openness and receptiveness to new ideas. And again, this is what I see in my community that is sort of a progressive little bubble, right? So when my grandson Edward comes home from school and mentions casually that his best friend Henry wore a dress to school, it's just nothing. I mean, he doesn't have any kind of negative reaction to it. It's just this is what Henry chose to wear today. When we listen to songs and I tell him that this is a spiritual that slaves used to sing, and then he hears about people in the news, Black people who are treated poorly, brutally. And he asks, I thought this had ended. When will this end? The fact that he even asks those questions gives me hope.
Okay, well, with that, I'll say thank you very much. And you are a true legend of Simpson, and we really appreciate you being with us here today. And thank you for all of the participants that also asked questions and tuned in today as well. Thank you so much. And hopefully we will be back in 2024 with another Legends of Simpson series. Have a great day, everyone.
Yeah, and do share my contact information, phone number and email. One of the disadvantages of spending your time with a lot of your time with a 6-year-old and a 1-year-old is that sometimes you're very hungry for adult conversation. So I wish you all the best. Thank you for letting me do this.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you.